Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Thank you. My name is Saji Prelis with Search for Common Ground. I want to really welcome all of you who are joining us today in person, and I also want to welcome everyone else who is joining us online from around the world. Thank you for making time to be here with us. I'm really happy to kickstart this really important discussion around the role of young people play in peace and security efforts. Again, my name is Saji with Search for Common Ground. Before we get started though, I want to make a huge thank you to the Education Above All Foundation, Reach Out to Asia, and VICE for hosting this conversation together with Search for Common Ground. Because it's important when we have these big, amazing conferences that you're creating more spaces for young people and how young people are shaping the world. This conversation is all about that. So I want to acknowledge Education Above All and Rota's leadership in this process. Also want to acknowledge the ambassadors who are here and all the young students who are also joining us in person. To set the tone for today's event, I want to share a little bit of a few slides with you to kind of introduce what this agenda is all about. So bear with me. There are folks joining online also. And let me start by describing why young people matter around the world. I don't need to tell young people why this matters, but I want to tell others why this matters also. When you look around the world, the countries in green on this map, the median age in these countries is in the teenage years. The median age in these countries is the teens. The countries like Niger, Mali, the median age is like 15. About 1 in 4 young people around the world are affected by violent conflict around today. Over 600 million or so people, that's up comes to about 600 or so million people. What's fascinating is in less than 10 years from now, less than 10 years, over 60% of the urban population will be under the age of 18. So it's a fascinating number of people who are going to be occupying this planet. So if we move further, we see around the world that people are losing faith and trust in governments. Young people's aspirations are not being met. There's a growing distrust that is happening while these populations are growing. So I want to, for a long time in the international spaces, young people have been seen as a problem that needs to be corrected by policymakers. And the reason that has been coming out was because of a policy panic. Policy panic that was found at the foundation of it was fear. But the international community came together because of young people and said, let's change that story. Let's change the story to create a policy opportunity, to see young people as partners in a process. And this was the birth of the Youth, Peace and Security Agenda. So allow me to talk about how this agenda was developed. We were coming together, young people, international organizations, civil society coming together to shape an agenda. And we wanted to create an agenda that will endure, that will sustain. And this agenda was sustaining by creating a set of norms, a set of political norms that shape a new conversation about young people as peace builders. Second was we wanted to make sure that there are institutions around the world, from governments and others, are strengthening their commitment to see young people as partners. And the third is make sure that young people's work is properly financed and resourced so they have the capacities and ability to act. It was done by setting up a global coalition coming together with United Nations actors, international NGOs, intergovernmental bodies who you'll hear from today, and young people as partners, collaborating to shape what we call the Youth, Peace and Security Agenda. What's important to hear here is, this is not a UN agenda. This is not an international NGO agenda or a youth agenda. It's a collective agenda. And that's important to know because compared to a lot of agendas where young people are beneficiaries, here young people are partners in shaping this agenda also. Let me also start by saying that this field at the time was governed by a lot of old questions based on fear. And those questions were like, why are young people joining armed groups? Why are young people joining violent narratives? Why are they susceptible to violent narratives? While sometimes those questions might be important, we realized we're asking the wrong question. So we forced ourselves to ask a new question. And the new question was a very simple question. Why are most youth peaceful? And this was the beginning, guiding question for this agenda. And that was a powerful motivator for us. So let me introduce what the norm-shaping agenda is. This picture was taken exactly 6 years ago today at the Security Council, December 9, 2015. Some of you are nodding your heads because I know you were there in spirit and physically as we celebrated this momentous occasion. Because 6 years ago, today, this resolution was introduced, Security Council Resolution 2250. For the first time, the Security Council acknowledged young people are a powerful force for peace, and they should be seen as partners, and encouraged governments to see young people as partners. They didn't come from the Security Council. Over 11,000 young people from over 110 countries and territories shaped and influenced this agenda. So that was what the Security Council responded to. Then, in 2018, Security Council followed suit with a second resolution, really going into saying young people not only are partners in peace, but they need to be engaged in peace processes also. And engaged in peace processes where they have a voice and an opportunity to shape the discourse. The third Security Council happened in 2020. And that recognized the civic space young people are occupying is coming under threat, and it needs to be protected. And governments need to act better to protect the civic spaces young people occupy online and in physical spaces. Collectively, what these resolutions do is they recognize young people as a political force for peace. It's not enough that you say young people are good for sports and culture, but it's also important to recognize young people as political actors for peace too. Collectively, these resolutions do that. The institutional commitments that came because of these resolutions. There are regional, so this map shows how young people are not waiting for governments to act. Around the world, young people are starting their coalitions, coming together with other actors to set up coalitions of groups to say that we are partners in peace. Regional networks are also starting across the Middle East and North Africa, across Southeast Asia, across Central and South America and the Americas. We have someone in the audience from Latin America who is chairing and leading one of those coalitions. Today you will hear from some institutions who are excited about this and also committed to this agenda. The United Nations, European Union, African Union are also excited and are committed to this agenda. The United States government, governments are acting too. The US government is the first government in the world to introduce legislation to show how their commitment to young people matter in foreign policy efforts. How young people are not beneficiaries only, but partners in shaping and influencing US government's foreign policy agenda. So with this increasing support for young people, I talked about the shrinking civic space. These barriers that young people face didn't come from scholars. These barriers came from young people from about 35 to 40 countries around the world who identified that these are their primary barriers. Socio-cultural barriers are the primary thing, number one barrier that they face, next to political, financial, legal, and what we are seeing around the world is the pandemic and climate change has exacerbated these barriers even further. So these barriers, collectively, we have identified is violence in itself to young people who are excluded from society. If we are trying to address young people as partners, we need to make sure we overcome, address how to overcome these barriers itself. So, some exciting news to share with you on top of this. The governments of Qatar, Colombia, and Finland have also come together saying we want to do some more to it. So there's a whole lot of actions happening. Started in 2019 in Finland with the resolution 2419 in 2018. Then the next year, the government of Finland partnered with the state of Qatar and Colombia to organize the first symposium on young people's roles in peace processes. Young people play a role in peace processes in Yemen and Syria and South Sudan and other places. This was a conference to recognize how young people can play a better role. You'll hear a little bit more about this later. Following that, because of the increasing demand, more organizations come on board to say, how can we commit? So with these organizations coming on board, in Qatar next year, we will have 2 key outputs that are being developed as we speak. The first is guidance for governments on how to inclusively engage young people and implement young people, youth peace and security strategies at the country level. Second is a 5-year roadmap, a strategic roadmap, so to say, on how to build a field of young people as partners in peace processes itself. So these 2 outputs are being developed, and I'm going to introduce you to them very shortly. The conference is happening next month in January, 19th through the 21st. And the state of Qatar is hosting it, and it's going to be online with over 50 countries who are committed to joining online, with foreign ministers, prime ministers, presidents who are coming together to say we are collectively committing to this agenda. So this is an exciting moment in the youth space when it comes to peace and security efforts. So I'm really happy that this event is joined by so many people who can understand this and also now get on board to supporting this agenda. So with that, I'm going to transition a little bit to invite a distinguished guest who is going to talk to us a little bit about how institutions are committing to it. Ambassador Roderick-Victor, who is the African Union Commission representative for the Commissioner at the Political Affairs, is joining us online. Before he rushes to another meeting, I want to invite him to kickstart this conversation. Ambassador Ngoga, are you with us?
Yes, I'm with you, and thank you so much.
Wonderful.
I wish I was there with you in person, but as you can hear in my voice, I think that little bug got to me, the bug that has been circulating around the globe. So unfortunately, so I could not travel. But I'm so excited to be here with you, particularly excited to talk about how we are committed to this agenda in the African continent. You know, on the African continent, we have about 226 million youth. This was in 2015, between the ages of 15 to 24. And they project that in 2030, there will be about 42% more. So for us, our continent is young, and we see our youth as an asset, not as a burden. And so that is why we have actually moved to really try to be as inclusive as possible that we feel are important. First area is governance, because for us, when it comes to governance, we feel that this is where we need to make significant improvement, because I think in his presentation, Saji was talking about the fact that there is a sort of divorce between those who govern and those who are being governed. And we want to create a sort of social contract between, also to make sure that their voices are heard. Right now, across our continent, when you look, there is robust investment in involving the youth, in creating banks for them, and in making sure that their voices are heard, even in parliament. We have many governments who have now appointed youth in government, and we are very excited about that. The other area where we think that we want to involve the youth is in the area of security. As you know, we have many security challenges today on the continent, and we want to make sure that the youth is involved in not only in early warning, but also that they are involved in matters related to prevention in general, structural or operational prevention, and also in mediation efforts. Often the youth everybody talks about, having the youth at the table, but when you look in mediation efforts, very rarely would you have them sit at the table, or they would have a token. But we want to make sure that they are involved in mediation efforts, and most importantly, in the electoral observer mission as well. We have started already making sure that in our electoral observer missions that they're involved. The other area, the third area that is extremely important to us is socioeconomic. Of course, our #1 challenge is to create youth jobs. And my colleague Bruce, who's there, will talk about this initiative, because we want to make sure that not only we provide good education to our youth, but also that we find them jobs that are sustainable and jobs that are dignified. So there is a lot of initiatives like that, but I just wanted to highlight those three areas as areas of focus for us. And I can tell you that this agenda remains a priority not only for our commissioner. My colleague will talk about the 5-year framework. I won't want to go into those details, but we're so excited, and we want to thank the government of Qatar, WISE Summit, for organizing this event. And I hope that I will have a chance to interact with all of you in the near future. Meanwhile, I just want to tell you that the number one challenge we have on the continent, not only on the African continent, but I think across the world, is the erosion of norms and the normalization of intolerance. And I cannot talk to a conference with youth and youth leaders without mentioning this, because I think it is time also that we reset our values, because it is only by resetting our values that we will also bring our youth to be actually actors of peace and to contribute. So I hope that you will be reflecting on this as well, because this is an enormous challenge that we have in this today and age and this global order. And I thank you so much for your kind attention, and I wish you all the best.
Thank you, Ambassador Ngoga, for taking the time out of your very busy schedule to join us and give some words of inspiration, but also really highlight how the African Union is really committed to a continent where the median age is about 19. So it's important to recognize that, and how the institutions are committing to this matters, because it shows young people around the world that governments and institutions hear them, see them, and they feel like they've been recognized. So these are powerful commitments, and you'll hear more about them today. So I'm going to take a step back a little bit, and really, I shared with you 2 outputs that are being developed that will be launched next month here in Doha at the online conference on youth and peace processes. So the first one is focused on young people and peace processes. The ambassador talked about the role of young people in peace processes, and it's an important aspect. So I'm going to bring in Irena Grizelj, who is a co-author, who is co-authoring this strategy with us, who has engaged governments, who has engaged mediators, who has engaged young people, who has engaged the European Union, African Union, the UN, to gather evidence about how can we commit to this agenda over the next 5 years. So I'm going to invite her to share with you. This is a sneak peek. This is a sneak peek to the agenda that's going to be shared next month. So I'm inviting Irena to come in and share with us why this agenda matters and what it looks like. Irena, the digital floor is yours. The virtual floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Saji. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. It's a real privilege and a pleasure to be here virtually with you all today, and I send my best regards from afar. So in light of time, and to get really into what Saji has opened the floor for, I'm just going to share my screen so I can visually take you through the strategy as well. All right, I hope everyone can see my slides fine.
Yeah, we can see you well. The slides.
Excellent. Thank you. Great. So I want to just highlight and emphasize some of the background to this output ahead of the Doha conference, which Saji has presented, noting that this strategic roadmap that I'll get into really focuses on a more specific component within the youth, peace, and security agenda, and complements the YPS guidelines that Celina will come in on in a moment, through focusing on the more specific area of peace and mediation processes. And I want to recognize the 3 UN Security Council resolutions on youth, peace, and security, which call for the establishment of integrated mechanisms for meaningful participation of youth in peace processes, calling for inclusive representation of youth in the prevention and resolution of conflict, including when negotiating and implementing peace agreements, and recognizing that the participation of young people in peace processes can significantly contribute to the maintenance and promotion of international peace and security. And this framework roadmap that I'll get into really builds on the first global policy paper, which was launched 2 years ago in Helsinki, that really documented where and how young people shape peace processes and peace agreements, and why youth-inclusive peace processes are fundamental not only to the prevention of violence, but particularly to sustaining peace. So delving into that, and some of these points have already been raised, why do we talk about youth and peace processes? Why does it matter? We know that young people are often the largest demographic in countries with ongoing peace processes, and indeed, as Saji shared, the largest in the world today. For example, 72% of South Sudan's population is under the age of 30 years old. 67% of Afghanistan's population is under the age of 25 years old. And while over 1,000 peace agreements have been signed in the last 20 years, which is often the heart of peacemaking in a society that is undergoing conflict, there has been very limited attention and investment in the role and impact that young people have on peace processes. Young people also play an inherently role in the prevention of violence and sustaining peace. As documented in the We Are Here reports, young people demonstrate constructive and alternative channels to conflict resolution, often considered informal, but really fundamental in shaping the ground for sustaining peace and these formal processes. Young people often have long-term mindsets on peace. They focus on just issues that underpin healthy, peaceful, and equitable societies. Yet we find that they're seldom engaged as key strategic partners in building peace and co-leading conflict resolution. So
Irena?
there's both a... Hello?
Irena, sorry to interrupt you, Irena. Can I ask you to remove the text box from your slides so you can move the slides ahead? I'm sorry to interrupt you as you were talking. Because we are not seeing the slides that you're sharing.
Sorry. Let me try that again. Is it gone?
Can you make sure that we have Irena back on the screen? Apologize for the technical difficulty.
Is that clear?
Yes, just take yeah, we can see your slides now, but we have a text box appearing as well. But go ahead and
I'm sorry. Okay, well, you can focus on my words. I hope the text box is not too large.
No, go ahead.
I'm not sure. Okay. Okay, so I hope I can share what's on the slides and really demonstrate that through my voice then. Really recognizing that there is both a political then and a demographic imperative to ensuring that peace processes are shaped by and supportive of young people's participation. This agenda, this strategy also recognizes that there is a rapidly changing conflict landscape. Violent conflicts are increasingly fragmented, protracted, and transnational. There's a rising prevalence and misuse of digital technologies. There's an escalating climate crisis and a global health pandemic. Traditional approaches are no longer as effective as previously. And so there's an urgent need to shift to a whole of society, inclusive and long-term approach to conflict resolution and sustaining peace. And so coming then into what is this strategy? What is this roadmap that Saji has opened the floor for? So this is really a strategic action plan and builds on the title, We Are in This Together, to realizing more youth-inclusive peace processes. I want to emphasize that this has been a year-long, inclusive, transparent, and participatory process that has engaged almost 100 experts from across regional, international, and national organizations and contexts to really shape and take this strategy forward. Taking everything that's just been shared, the guiding vision is quite simple: that peace processes are supportive and shaped by young people's participation, ultimately realizing more inclusive and peaceful societies. The strategy has 4 key aims or objectives to lead us towards this vision. And that is that by 2026, we have established and strengthened political and institutional commitments to implement full and effective, meaningful participation of young people in peace processes, developing youth-sensitive and gender-responsive capacity-strengthening resources and knowledge tools to support youth engagement in peace processes, developing really a collaborative effort, a community of practice and partnerships to take this strategy forward, to implement, monitor, and collaborate. And finally, mobilizing sustainable resources and financing to realize the strategy's vision. The target really is the wide spectrum of actors, governments, mediation support units, civil society, international and regional organizations that are engaged in peace processes. And the aim is really to move from policy and norms to practice, from the why to the how of youth-inclusive peace processes. And that's to reflect the lived reality of young women and men in conflict and affected settings, really generating this holistic, long-term, intergenerational strategy that will create this environment for more youth-inclusive peace processes. Moving into briefly some of the substance of the strategy, it is founded and shaped by 4 key pillars or interconnected streams. And this is around institutionalization and policy, which is the systematic mainstreaming of youth-inclusive policies and practices within organizations and institutions. Capacity strengthening, which is about shaping and strengthening the attitudes, skills, and knowledge for more youth-inclusive practices, not only of young people, as is often assumed, but also institutional leadership, politicians, policymakers, civil servants, and civil society. Knowledge solutions is around building an evidence base. When we know more, we can do better. So this is around documenting the impact and best practice on how to include young people and how peace processes can be shaped by young people's participation. And finally, the strategy builds on the principle and the spirit of the Youth, Peace, and Security Agenda, which is founded on collaboration and partnerships for collective impact, really recognizing that our collective efforts together generate a stronger and a more sustainable impact than working in silo or segregated efforts. And this is the backbone through which we really want to take this strategy forward. There's a number of cross-cutting issues that underpin how to implement this strategy that really seek to do no harm in young people's participation and ensure that this is a meaningful strategy. And I can go into these perhaps in the question and answer, but this is around, firstly, recognizing that security and protection of young people is fundamental in supporting their participation. Secondly, that recognizing young people are diverse, and so young people need to be considered from their different lived realities and experiences in conflict. Third, a strategy is only effective if it is funded with adequate resources to implement the actions. Fourth, communication. That's around harnessing the power of communication in shaping a new set of societal norms and the institutional acceptance of young people as necessary agents in the prevention of violence, in political decision-making, and in building foundations for peaceful societies. And finally, recognizing the potential of technology to both disrupt and facilitate peace processes. This is around harnessing innovation and digital technology in the design and implementation of more youth-inclusive processes. So just a few then closing considerations before we open the floor. The first is that we need to have a holistic shift in how we perceive and engage with young people. We must move beyond seeing youth as beneficiaries of peace processes, but as necessary partners and co-leaders essential in the prevention of violence and reconstruction of just and inclusive societies. This must be taken forward together and working together with young people. There must be buy-in from youth, and to ensure there is buy-in from young people, governments, international, regional, and national institutions responsible for peace efforts really need to reaffirm their relationship with young women and men as part of weaving a new social contract. And finally, and this has been raised before, there needs to be resources and serious commitment to this agenda. This includes mainstreaming of youth-inclusive and gender-responsive practices, but also investing sufficient resources to ensure that peace processes respond to the realities, challenges, and needs of young people of all genders within conflict societies, ultimately bringing us forward towards our common guiding vision of more peaceful, representative, and inclusive societies. I pause there and I thank you all. I open the floor for some questions and reflections.
Thank you, Irena. I hope you can hear the enthusiasm of the audience who is applauding to you, and I'm also hoping the online audience who is joining us also is applauding to you, because it's a very thorough presentation that you gave about a sneak peek. When I said a sneak peek, it was a really detailed, powerful presentation about what's going to be launched next month here in Doha, Qatar. So I'm going to open up for a few minutes to see if anyone from the audience has questions. There are mics on both sides. If you want to raise your hand, someone will come to you and you can ask questions. This is a conversation. This is not a one-way presentation. This is a conversation. So there are two questions. I'll come first there and then come here second. So Irena, you can hear us, right?
Hi, Irena. Thank you so much for all that you're doing. I was listening to you, and you were talking about the no harm policy. I love everything that's going on, but as a teacher, there is a part of me that youth have been beneficiaries because we're afraid. We want to protect them. And so if you could just elaborate more about the no harm policy and how we can have youth as equal partners without exposing them to unnecessary harm, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for the question. It's an important question. I'll come here. Leonardo has a question, and then we'll give a chance to Irena to respond.
Yes, thank you so much, Irena, for your question. My question is how to ensure the commitment of institutions and different governments to implement this agenda. We have been going with this for 5 years, 6 years already. Today's the anniversary. But when we see the progress on the ground and how meaningful is the participation of young people, that's the missing piece. That's something that's still lacking. So how can we push forward governments to really take this as a deep commitment that they have?
Wow, two important questions. I'm going to ask Irena to see if you can answer it, but also if Celina can also come in, because you're developing another guidance that the audience will hear from, who can also chime into this. So start with Irena.
Thank you so much for those questions. Those are really excellent points that you've raised. On the point of do no harm, this is really fundamental. We find that young people are already active and mobilizing and across different spaces, and I think it's the realization that we need to take that more seriously. It's not that young people are on the streets or seeking for participation or mobilizing different initiatives because they feel like it, but because it really has such essential contributions and it's a necessary component to an inclusive and a peaceful society. And so in the do no harm component, unfortunately, we find that young people in their striving for participation in different arenas, there are repercussions that they face, serious risks to their lives. And the various UN Security Council resolutions are calling for greater investment in protection of young people. So I see it as two ways. One, it's realizing that young people need to be taken seriously as partners, as co-leaders. And secondly, that in young people's participation in creating spaces and opening these spaces, we cannot allow risks and repercussions in those spaces. We need to make sure that there are safe spaces in the negotiation room as well as on the streets and civic spaces. So I hope that answers a little bit your question, and I think it's something that we need to continue to work on throughout this agenda. And ensuring these commitments, and thank you for raising that, Leonardo, that's critical, and that's what we're looking to do, and that's part of this event and also in the lead up to Doha, recognizing that of course change takes time, but also noting that there are small incremental steps we can take to not only commit, but then implement those commitments. And that's what the strategy seeks to do. We have, next 5 years that we're looking to take steps towards more youth inclusive peace processes, and the commitment of governments, of different institutions is fundamental in that, because partnerships and ensuring we do that together, it won't go far if we're not partnering. So I think it's, again, taking this seriously, making sure the commitments are serious and the investments, and taking those steps from the commitment to the implementation. That's a necessary step that needs to be taken moving forward. And I open the floor. Celina, if you'd like to come in, and also Saji. Thank you.
Celina, we haven't officially introduced you, but I think I would love for you to come in as well. Dr. Celina is one of the other authors of the second output on guidance for governments as well, or on how to implement peace and security efforts. Dr. Celina, do you want to come in as well?
Yes, thank you, and it's a pleasure for me to join you. The question of Leonardo is excellent. It's about how to make commitments real. It's a very big question. If we look at history, how social change has happened and how governments got to commit, there are different ways. One is dialogue, convincing, understanding. There are technical reasons that we can introduce into our arguments. There are democratic. So social movements have changed agendas. And so the role of young people's advocacy in making the resolution happen is one example. Now we need to keep going in that, engaging in that dialogue, and also the effectiveness reasons, and then the how is some governments, they have some commitments, but they haven't taken that step of exactly how. So that's, it's a long journey, but it's a mixture of dialogue and to accompany that process. It's not easy because there are many different political forces and ideologies that may resist change and may have doubts. So we need to keep engaging in that dialogue and trying to go step by step. And it's a really big question for a political scientist, for maybe a study, like a deeper study. But social change has happened and can happen, and it's driven by those that are most affected or most engaged in the agenda. So we learn from human peace and security. In this case, youth-driven movements have a big role to play, and governments are starting to listen, and this is documented. Sorry, I extended. You're very passionate. It's a great question. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. I'm going to move to the next session and have Celina come back. But the reason why we are having this session also is to show that more and more institutions, intergovernmental bodies, governments are starting to understand this agenda and see how they can engage in this agenda. So this is why this event is taking place. This is why the state of Qatar has committed to this agenda by hosting us next month as well, with other heads of governments and other governments coming on board to shape this collective agenda. So with that, I want to pivot to asking Dr. Celina Del Felice to come back to talk about the other output that is being developed, that you have been developing with a host of other actors, including young people, in designing what kind of guidance can you give governments as their public officials. They are grappling with, how do I engage my population as partners in developing a strategy? And you develop the guidance for that. Please, Dr. Celina Del Felice, can you share with us what you have found?
Okay, thank you very much. I will share my slides. Can you see them?
Yeah, we can see them now.
Okay, yes, thank you very much. Yeah, it's a pleasure for me to share about this publication, this guide. The title we have given to it is Implementing the Youth Peace and Security Agenda at Country Level, a Guide for Public Officials. So I want to share in one slide what I want to share in the whole presentation. So in case I get too passionate, you get the takeaways in one slide. So first, why? The why to support public officials in the implementation of this agenda, both those that are already engaged and need to take new steps, and those that might be interested or exploring, so that they get motivated or curious and learn a bit more. Or maybe they don't know how to start, so it starts with very basic steps, and the idea is to engage them. How does it work? So it has quite a number of suggestions of different options of implementation, and the aim is not to be prescriptive, because there cannot be one model for all countries in the world. So each country needs to develop its own path, and based on their country's priorities, context, capacities. So that was a beauty and a challenge, because it's a guide for all countries with very different realities. So we wanted to give many suggestions, but also tools for that ownership, so that those that are planning implementation, of course, through multi-stakeholder spaces, can do analysis jointly, the planning and practical steps in different topics. I will come to those specifics. And many examples. So we try to document how governments, both at national and sub-national governments, are already implementing the agenda. So we want to inspire public officials and say, hey, this has been done. Oh, yeah, we are doing this. We can do a bit more, or we can maybe adapt that. So we tried. There are many limitations, as we will. In the implementation there are challenges, but there are some practices even before the agenda had been formalized by the resolution. So yes, it's difficult, but we can do it. And who developed it? It was developed through multi-stakeholder partnerships in which states, UN entities, and civil society organizations participated. We thought the process was important, as Irena was saying, also for the strategy. The process matters to make the content relevant. So Saji introduced the resolution. This is why today is such a special day for all of us, part of the YPS community, because it recognized young people's contributions. And as Leonardo was saying, 6 years later, but 5 years later, the Secretary General concluded in his report on YPS that yes, there is a growing recognition of young people's role in peace and security. This is indicated, as I was saying, in the increasing number of initiatives, but yet there are important challenges. Can you see my slides, right?
Yeah, we can. We can see your slides.
Okay, thank you. I was checking. Yes, there are important challenges. Still, how to make participation in the spaces meaningful and that young people can really affect outcomes and influence decision making. This is still a big challenge. Violations of their human rights. You, Saji, were referring to the shrinking of civic space, and this is very worrisome. And insufficient investment. Yes, there are commitments, but limited investment. So the report called for accelerated implementation, and a few months later, a new resolution of the Security Council made very specific recommendations when also calling for accelerated implementation. Dedicated roadmaps, policies and programs, sufficient resources, implementation through participatory processes with young people, and mechanisms to monitor, evaluate, and coordinate efforts. So the guidance of what needs to be done is quite clear and quite specific, but then the question is how. So we started building on already existing resources, which are amazing, and I will mention a few. I want to stress that the guide is building on all that experience and resources. There was one toolkit developed by the United Network of Young Peace Builders together with Search for Common Ground, was one of the first toolkits after the resolution, how to translate it into practice, with a lot of emphasis on implementation that has to be done through collaborative approaches and coalitions. The missing piece study that we mentioned also, very comprehensive study, very specific recommendations. The We Are Here report that Irena has mentioned, and we have the honor to have her also with us today, with also, again, very inspiring documentation of how young people are already contributing to peace processes. And then 2 handbooks published last year and this year, handbooks that are very detailed, the last one I'm showing is the programming handbook for UN entities. So we had these resources, but we didn't have a guide for supporting specifically public officials and the implementation at a country level. So we started thinking of executive officials, a head of a governmental entity, civil servants, public officers working in different ministries, not only youth of peace and security, but also education ministries, ministries of justice, ministries of health, and elected officials, parliamentarians, their advisors, mayors. And also the guide also we think is of use to those that are partnering with governments. It has 6 chapters. The first chapter introduces the agenda. We cannot assume that public officials are acquainted with it, so we explain the key concepts. And as I said, we have 10 tools. I will share with you one, two of them is the context analysis through a youth lens. So for public officials to understand the relevance that the agenda has for their own specific country context. Chapter 2 is where we spell out and describe all these possible ways. And we have excellent examples already. The African Union's Continental Framework and its 10-year implementation plan, very rich document. 2 national action plans adopted this year in Finland and Nigeria. We give more examples of roadmaps and also policies, programs, projects, and services that include YPS objectives. And so that's how it was working. It's suggestions, but based on existing practice. It might not be perfect practice, but it's a practice that we can all learn from. A chapter on coordination mechanisms, as I was saying, issues like mandates, focal points, multi-stakeholder coalitions. A chapter 4 on institutional capacities is not only about training, but how to create ownership and institutionalizing of the agenda. Chapter 5 about resources mobilization, budgeting, and very importantly, how to make resources available for youth-led groups that are usually very underfunded, working voluntarily, but at the front lines of youth peace work. And finally, but not least, participatory processes with young people. So what does this mean? What does it mean and how do we facilitate participatory processes? So we spell out and explain the key principles and then the practicalities. We give some suggestions. Also the risks and the benefits and also things to consider when implementing it. And we give some examples of forms of youth participation in peace and security. So finally, we believe that the guide is relevant to all countries. Yesterday at the launch of the Finnish National Action Plan, it was mentioned that we might consider Finland a very stable country, but still young people have challenges of hate speech, polarization. So all countries, those that are conflict-torn and other countries have different peace and security challenges, and we need to implement the agenda in all countries and also look at the interconnectedness among our countries. But the agenda wants to reinforce already existing national and local agendas that share the goals of the YPS agenda, national development plans, national peace and security plans. It's not building something new, it's doing what we are doing, but with a more focused and more thought through planning through the principles of the YPS agenda. And also the agenda is inherently linked to the 2030 agenda, 2030 agenda and the Women in Security, to name a few of global agenda. So I would leave it at that. I hope that you get some sense of what the guide is about, and I'll be happy to answer any questions. And these are all the partners. Sorry, all the partners mentioning them, I acknowledge them because it has been a lot of work this year, and I have the privilege to speak and present it, but it has been really a collective effort. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Celina Del Felice, for really laying out what this national guidance can look like, not just for states that are experiencing conflict, but states that are not necessarily experiencing all-out war, but young people face different challenges, and this guidance actually is useful for all states and all countries. So thank you for laying those powerfully. I'm going to open up for questions if anyone has any questions from the audience. And this time I'm going to start on this side and then come to that side. So I'll start with the gentleman here with the hands up, and then I'll come to this person over here on this side.
For Chapter 6, there are certain countries with certain values that people might have to prevent them from participating in activities willingly. How do you plan on overcoming cultural and ideological barriers to have people participate in something that they might disagree with or the parents might disagree with or something?
Good question. Thank you for asking that question. And we'll come to the second question here, and I'll ask Celina to come in. This gentleman over here. Can you raise your hand, please? Yeah.
Yeah, so first I'd like to congratulate all the actors who've built the guides, because providing recommendations and incentives to create a plan to include the youth is obviously extremely important. But I'd like to ask, how can, what's the best way to hold governments accountable to actually implement these recommendations? Because for these past 6 years, there have been a lot of recommendations and ideas set forth by the youth, but the governments haven't often been held accountable to enact these recommendations. So how do you think we can best push governments and hold them accountable to actually enact these things?
Amazing. Thank you so much. Powerful questions. I'm going to ask Dr. Celina to come in, and Irena, if you're still here, please come in as well. So the two questions are, Celina, do you want to come in?
Yes, about how to, involve young people that might not feel comfortable with certain values or their parents. I would say that the key is tolerance and cultural sensitivity and facilitating spaces that people may feel safe and going step by step. So I think there's a level, I would say I'm still working on my own tolerance, because I still feel that some things I don't feel comfortable with all the values of other people. So I think peace education and intercultural education are key to understand that we have tolerance. We may not like what others are saying or doing, and we still need to respect them as human beings. And then we can move from tolerance to appreciation, respect, understanding. Some may say these are not realistic. UNESCO has frameworks for this, to move from tolerance to appreciation and respect for cultural diversity. This is not easy in practice. So I think we need to go step by step, and the facilitation of spaces needs to be very carefully thought through, so that we go step by step and make people feel comfortable to engage in dialogue with issues that may be painful even or uncomfortable. So I think we need to go step by step. In some moments we may be ready to move one step. In other moments we may be prepared to engage in more difficult discussions. But I think we have to engage in difficult discussions, because if we don't dialogue with each other, then we have polarization and we grow further apart. And in this world, we have to learn how to coexist. So I think that's the challenge. It's not an easy answer, but I hope it gives you some ideas. Educationally, this is done, learning to disagree and and doing it progressively. Thank you.
Thank you. Irena, do you want to come in with the second question then? Around how do we hold governments accountable? How can young people hold government accountable when there's all these policies in place, but we don't see governments respond? Any thoughts from you around this, specifically around peace processes or any other ideas?
Thank you. Yes. Again, a really important question, a really important point, and one that we should all be reflecting on more, because it is fundamental. I would say this is really around harnessing that intergenerational relationship. There's a growing realization, including from governments, that in the various different crises that we face, a state-led approach is not as effective as a whole of society approach. It's not as sustainable. We're not going to get very far in addressing the interconnected issues and crises that we're facing, not only for conflict, but for the various global issues that we're facing. So we need to take this forward intergenerationally. It's not only that we need governments, but that governments need the various sectors of society, including and particularly young people, to come on board in order to realize their goals in moving forward. And so, yeah, I think it's through dialogue, through harnessing and strengthening this intergenerational relationship, and really trying to take this forward in a more holistic approach, realizing, and hence the title of the strategy as well, which is that we are in this together. And that needs to be a two-way conversation and a two-way relationship, holding one another accountable as we realize more inclusive and peaceful societies moving forward.
Thank you, Irena. I'm going to switch gears because these are powerful questions that have been asked, and these are questions that will continue to be asked in the next part of the session as well. And we've talked about the policy and the norm shaping and the tools being developed to act on those norms. And now we are shifting gears and bringing in other people to join me on this panel to talk about institutional commitments and how are institutions actively committing to this now. So they can also answer these questions. So I invite onto this panel to join me on stage Dr. Ruksako, Dr. Aleu Garang, and Sharon Dione, who is coming in from Cameroon. Please join me. And they're going to be joined by the additional speakers who are online, Julius Kramer and Saisabel from Jordan, who is also with us, who is online. So this is going to be an online and in-person panel discussion, and hopefully all the technology will work very well for all of us. So, Dr. Ruksako, thank you for being here. You're representing the African Union. You heard Ambassador Ngoga speak very powerfully about the institution's commitment. He mentioned the continental framework. What is the continental framework, and how is the African Union committed to support young people on a continent with a median age or so in the teens?
Thank you so much, Saji. It's good to be here. And I also want to extend all the thanks to, of course, everyone who's made this possible. And special thanks to those in the room, those online as well. I think it's really important to have voices heard from the youth demographic in shaping this agenda. To answer your question directly, the Continental Framework on Youth, Peace and Security is essentially the African Union's framework, if you like, or establishing norm to drive youth participation in peace and security, the entire gamut of peace and security, including, very important, conflict prevention. So we're not looking at young people simply from a perspective of post-conflict situations as those who suffer from conflicts, but as partners who can help both countries and institutions such as the AU prevent conflicts. Of course, to do this, we felt it was necessary to have this continental framework that would guide the African Union as an institution, that would encourage regional institutions, and I'm glad my colleague is here, he'll speak to that as well, to also develop norms at that level, and also something to guide member states, development partners, youth and their networks, to have, if you like, a common approach to encouraging youth participation in issues of peace and security. And I think, in a nutshell, this is what the Continental Framework is. But just to put as a footnote that this framework is not something that was done solely by the African Union as an institution, but it was developed alongside regional institutions and very importantly, youth and their networks. So this is something that is owned by everyone in Africa to drive the process of youth, peace and security on the continent.
Thank you, Dr. Rooks. Dr. Rooks is very famous on the continent because he's not only working with the African Union, but he's also a person who young people admire and respect as well. So whenever you hear from the continent, young people speak, this man's name is often mentioned alongside, because the youth agenda on the continent when it comes to peace and security are synonymous, because you've been championing this process. So thank you, Dr. Rooks, for really working in partnership with young people in shaping the continental framework itself, which is very much in line with what we've heard today also. So thank you for your leadership. I'm going to move across to the Intergovernmental Authority for Development. Dr. Aleu Garang, you've been part of peace processes also in South Sudan, and the institution is shaping peace processes as it called in to mediate conflicts on the continent, right? And you heard about the 5-year strategic plan on peace processes and how young people can be partners. How is IGAD contributing to this agenda, and how do you see young people contributing to shaping peace processes in the region?
All right, thank you very much, Saji, and thank you for distinguished delegates, youth, and interested community to this discussion, for this opportunity. As you know, in IGAD, which is a similar institution to what we call Majlis Town Al-Khaliji, which is the REC for this region, we are 8 member states: South Sudan, Djibouti, Uganda, Kenya, Somalia, Eritrea, and Ethiopia. And often there are some challenges in peacemaking in the region because of the prevalence of conflict. And part of what we have realized even before the discussion started around the global strategy of engaging youth in peace and security is we realize that our communities are widely youth. And these questions that were asked earlier, why are youth engaged into or in conflict, we started also seeing it differently, and that we needed to engage the youth in peacemaking for peace to continue. So it's not only being there as negotiators representing youth constituencies, but also trying to push for youth who are peacemakers to be mediators. There are so many other levels where we make peace. It's not necessarily track one where the conflict is addressed, but for peace to hold, it has to trickle down to community level, and that engages also various levels of youth as mediators, as peace champions, and also peace builders. And I would say gradually that whether it's conflict prevention, which is part of the continental frameworks done by the African Union and is synonymous with the global agenda. We also move to protection of youth and also engaging youth in policy making. So we want to see youth in peace spectrum, whether as mediators or negotiators or peace builders. But above all, this African Union agenda on actually preventing conflict is also where we champion most of our activities. So taking it to practical experiences in Sudan and South Sudan. South Sudan had a previous civil war where IGAD was the lead mediator, and we have been engaging the youth groups into multi-stakeholder discussions, bringing the youth on the table, not just as tokens, as normally tokenism is how it is done mostly, by processes that don't mean actual involvement, but we wanted more ownership by the people, not only the warring parties and the principals. And youth groups played a huge role in addition to women's groups and civil society groups. And today, if you go through the implementation mechanisms stated in the peace agreement, you will find the youth are the ones taking lead, whether it's reporting or holding the parties to the agreement accountable. Taking it to another process that is ongoing, the Sudan process, we try to oppose or impose new scenarios where the youth are the leading category in the revolution in Sudan. So instead of just coming through peace building mechanism or peacemaking mechanism as if we are just firefighters, we are trying to engage the youth into thinking ahead. And thank God that the youth in Sudan were wise enough to adopt a nonviolent protest. So throughout the protest is always about being peaceful. So we are talking about how youth could engage with policymakers, how they would engage with other generations that are above, who are decision makers, and such engagement, we called it intergenerational dialogue. So we are trying also to push the question of peace into spaces where not only is going to be peace implementation or holding peace, but also working towards engaging youth in governance without the fear that there will be a total takeover by the youth, and then the older groups will be kicked out. Thank you.
Thank you for that. It's a really important message you're also sending, how IGAD as an institution is really looking at very political spaces where adults are often the leads. You're looking at how to get people, everyday people, to feel part of something bigger and part of building their future from very early stages of a political process, like a peace process. So thank you for the leadership you're doing. Thank you for your commitment to this agenda as well. I'm going to start, and I want to also make sure those questions that were asked, we can come back in answering in the question and answer session also. I'm going to bring Julius Kramer, who is joining us online from the United Nations Assistance Mission in Somalia. He's been a youth champion also. And I want to ask you, Julius, as you come in, you've been a youth champion for many years. You've been in the Scouts for many years. And now you're working for the United Nations in Somalia as the youth focal point on peace and security. How is the United Nations mission in Somalia, assistance mission in Somalia, understanding the youth agenda? Because you're working in a country that is young. And how are you financing? What kind of lessons have you learned from resourcing young people in Somalia as partners in peace? Julius?
Thanks, Saji, and thanks to the hosts and everyone involved in making this session reality on the 6th anniversary of the Youth, Peace and Security Agenda. It's a huge privilege to be part of this esteemed group, and I think, you know, so much has already been said in terms of the conceptual framework of youth, peace and security and why we're doing this. I just want to sort of highlight that one of the most common questions I get in my role as the Youth, Peace and Security Advisor is what's the added value of young people in peace processes? And that question always puzzles me a bit, because Somalia is a country where 75 to 80% of the population is youth. So, you know, I'm quite sure that young people are asking what's the added value of all of these old people in peace processes who've driven elite negotiated solutions that have excluded young people for decades and are making decisions over the heads of the majority population. And I think that's sort of where we need to completely reshift our focus. And indeed, as has already been said, sort of we're asking oftentimes the wrong questions, or we're asking very heavily biased questions. And I think that's sort of where we need to start. And when it comes to the two outputs of this Doha conference in just a few weeks, I think they're, you know, huge resources to propel this agenda forward, make it more practical, more operational for those of us who are bureaucrats tasked with supporting its implementation and tasked with supporting young people from the institutional side, because after all, that is what happens when a Security Council resolution is passed, is that the institutions need to take responsibility. So I think step one for us is to be introspective as a UN mission, as an international organization, and as the international community at large, is to be introspective and look at what are our sort of biases. How have we previously engaged with young people? How do we engage with young people? And recognize that oftentimes it's unfortunately been tokenistic, and oftentimes our perception of such a large demographic, large, complex, diverse demographic, such as the youth population in Somalia, that our perception is oftentimes biased, actually, and that we sometimes reproduce stigmatizing narratives. An anecdote on that, I met a young public official just a few weeks ago who told me how he fears for his life every time he approaches the government building where he works, and he's worked there for a couple of years and still fears for his life for being perceived as a potential violent young man. So I think these stigmas are very real to young Somalis, and that's why protection and the do no harm sort of approach is really central to this. But more than being introspective, I think we need to look at our analysis, the ways in which we view the youth demographic, and see that, you know, by better understanding young people and their needs and views and identities and rights, we can better understand opportunities for peace and better understand conflict dynamics through their lens. And the fact that our understanding of conflict over so many years has oftentimes not included the views of young people, I think it's interesting, and we need to really sort of compensate for that and make sure that we see how age-based power structures cut across all conflict dynamics in society, but also pose huge opportunities for peace, specifically focusing on intergenerational dialogue, which is the theme of this session. And then we need to look at, when we sort of have the analysis, we need to look at the direction. And that is both the external direction that's provided to us by the UN Security Council. We're a special political mission, so we're guided by a UN Security Council mandate, and we've actually had youth participation as the core of that mandate since 2015. And I think we were one of the first UN missions to have that, and that gives us a huge opportunity to really make sure that YPS is at the center of all of our efforts, whether political or focused on peace building or other affairs. And I think understanding that mandate through a youth lens, not only the parts of the mandate that are explicitly focused on youth, but using this youth lens to enhance our understanding of all dimensions of our mandate, including security sector reform, disengagement and demobilization and reintegration of people previously associated with armed groups, etc., etc. So I think that's a key thing. Having an internal strategy to propel our own work on youth participation and youth empowerment is also crucial, because we need to recognize that if this is going to be a core part of what we do, then we need internal direction and we need internal mechanisms to make this happen in reality. So we have a UN Somalia youth strategy that we're currently reviewing. Youth, peace and security is a key part of that strategy, and that enables us to sort of really position youth as a cross-cutting priority throughout everything we do in the UN in Somalia, both UN agencies, funds and programs, and the UN Special Political Mission. And it really is about mainstreaming. I think, you know, we all agree that youth issues are never really youth issues. They cut across absolutely everything. So making sure that is the case in practice, I think, is something that we're working hard to do, and that requires capacity. And that's sort of the last point I want to make on how we're approaching the two outputs of the Doha conference, is that we need capacity. We need capacity of everyone working within the UN system to engage with young people, to have quality analysis about youth, and to make sure that we transform the ways in which we working or the ways in which we work, not only sort of add youth. I think sometimes that's a misconception that youth, peace and security is about adding youth to what we're already doing, or just adding, you know, a young person, a youth representative, or but I think it's really fundamentally about transforming our ways of working and letting young people shape the ways in which we approach peace building and conflict resolution and governance as public institutions. And that requires a whole lot of homework, and that requires a close partnership with young people, and all that comes with that. On financing, I want to make a couple of points. You know, young people do incredible work with or without cash, and I think just imagine what young people could do and the change they could drive at a local level if they were sufficiently funded, if they were sufficiently supported, and frankly just not worked against, because oftentimes the civic spaces of young people is not necessarily a matter of them being well funded or not, but oftentimes a matter of them being actively worked against or not, and some of these stigmatizing ways of viewing young people, of course, further shrinks their civic spaces. So I think we need to look at funding as one tool, but we also need to make sure that funding doesn't distort priorities and doesn't manipulate the priorities of young people working locally. That funding is directed to support youth-led work, not that youth-led work is directed to get funding. And oftentimes, I think we in the international community have some work to do on that. Of course, accessibility of funding is a huge issue for young people, and localized sort of grant-making mechanisms need to be expanded. and also how we see results. That, you know, results in peace building are not always seen within the time period that a peace building project is employed or funded, and especially when it comes to young people's participation, I think we need to be very conscious about the fact that young people driving peace will always be important, regardless of what major sort of impacts we can communicate externally to donors or as donors. But in Somalia, we're working very much with, we're benefiting from the Peace Building Fund, which has been really helpful to sort of have a dedicated, and this is the Secretary General's Peace Building Fund, which is a dedicated funding window for youth peace and security. And that has sort of helped us shift our own ways of working, find innovative approaches to support young people's agency and rights at the local level in peace building efforts. And unfortunately, the funding is sometimes small, but it's also too large for local youth organizations to be able to apply for it. So that's still a challenge, and competition is very stiff. So it's difficult to fund a wide range of issues in Somalia. But I think to us, this source of funding has been helpful to trigger larger, more widespread and wider engagements on youth peace and security and how we work, and not only sort of paying out sort of cash, but reviewing our own ways of working. So Saji, I'm going to stop there and welcome any questions later on. Thanks.
Thank you, Julius. I appreciate you giving such a comprehensive view of how the UN mission, assistance mission, is actually supporting and acting on this agenda, and really thinking so comprehensively about its response. So far, you have heard about the norms. You've heard institutions, intergovernmental bodies, UN actors really committing to this and really trying to come up with policies and programs to support young people. We're going to shift a little bit of gears. Before we do that, I'm going to see if there are questions from the audience. But the next segment is about hearing from how young people and governments are also responding to this. So we have two young people who will be speaking, and a government official from the Democratic Republic of the Congo speaking. For that, we will ask you to have your interpretation devices handy. But let's take one or two questions and then go to the next segment. I have a young lady over there and two questions here. So we'll take all three questions together and answer. But I'm going to ask our panelists to stay online because these questions could be coming in the next session also. So one question there and two here.
Could you please speak more about youth jobs? Because a lot of the young people who have acted by themselves without adults. So if there's like any jobs for young people, what are they?
You're asking about young people, jobs for young people, right? Okay, good. Thank you. And we'll get these two questions and come in.
Hello. Thank you. It was very great educating myself about these important interventions. My question really is about a very specific subset of youth, and Julius mentioned this briefly, those that are involved in political violence, militants themselves, because from where I come from, a significant portion of youth, their grievances were mobilized by politicians in Nepal, and they engaged very militaristically in the civil war or the Maoist war or whatever we'd like to call it. And some of them were sympathizers as well, and so on and so forth. So what does the process really look like of incorporating this subset of youth, transitioning them to peace processes, the challenges that are involved there, making them commit to the commitments of these peace processes if they were themselves involved within these militaristic processes before? So yeah, that would be my question.
Powerful. Thank you so much. That's a very critical question you're asking. Thank you. We'll ask one more question and ask our panelists to respond.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. My question would be, beyond the dialogue that we have, the policies, the pillars that we have set, how do we ensure that they are implemented from the grassroots level, even before they get to the global scope? This includes the undocumented conflicts, like, for example, where I come from in my country, conflicts happen and most of them don't get reported to the media. That doesn't mean that they're not happening in the grassroots level, in the villages, in the communities. And until they get a trending video or it trends on Twitter, that's when the KOT will now ask for action, and that's when the government or even the UN agencies will decide to take up action on it, because now it's trending and it's going worldwide. It has spread across the globe, and now that is what will give them motivation to now take action on that particular conflict. So my question is, how do we ensure that either this conflict, even those ones that don't make it to the mainstream media, they are addressed and prevented and even mitigated properly to help those ones in the grassroots level? Thank you very much.
Wow, wow, thank you. Thank you so much. So you're hearing about jobs, but then you're hearing about transition, and you're also hearing about unrecognized conflicts and prevention. So who would like to respond to these powerful questions? Dr. Rooks, you have an obligation here.
Yes, Saji. And thank you so much. And I think rather than take the individual questions, I will respond to them as one, because I think they are interrelated. And I say so because the research shows that where there are not a lack of jobs, but I would say lack of or inadequate socioeconomic opportunities for young people, they tend to turn to conflict. In other words, they are more susceptible to join either conflict or illegal organizations and the likes. And when they go in there, does that necessarily spell the end of their futures? Should that be the case? I mean, I'm rephrasing the second question, and the answer to that is no. And then how do you ensure implementation of policies? And I'll use the continental framework as that policy to answer these questions and give a way forward. Just to go back a step perhaps is to say, one of the things young people in Africa themselves said at the inauguration of my program, the Youth for Peace Africa program of the African Union, we asked them, what are your priorities? And one of the 4 priorities they set for us was, we want a framework on youth, peace and security. At the time, the African Union was going through the process through the AGA Secretariat, which is the Africa Governance Architecture, to do a framework on youth. And when we went back and said, listen, if this is the priority of young people, we as a responsible institution must respond to that need. Gone are the days when we sit in Addis Ababa and you design what you think people need. You need to listen to them and then respond to them. So that was number 1. One of the things that framework does is to recognize that Africa has several conflicts, both globalized, localized, and like you mentioned, those that are just underneath the radar. And what is the response to this? Twofold. One is in terms of after the conflict, so post-conflict. What happens to the young people that have been dragged into that conflict, mostly not by their will? We need to find ways to reintegrate them into society. But there's a difficulty, and that is, if we ask everyone in this room, how would you feel having someone between the age of 12 and 18 who was, carrying a gun? How would you feel with him being your next door neighbor? We all will show some sense of nervousness, we have to be frank. But what we have done, and ironically last Friday we had an intergenerational dialogue on this topic. We took all 5 priorities of the framework, all right? And the question we were asking is, how can we begin as Africans question the modalities set globally, and how can we localize them? The legal system of you were a gun carrier, you go to jail, does that work for us? And these are the questions that we need to keep assessing to find the meaningful ways to ensure that young people who have suffered from conflict are not then excluded from having the lives that they deserve. And I think just very quickly to address the third strand of the question is on the local conflicts and the unidentified conflicts. A priority of the framework is on participation. And to us, participation means equipping young people with knowledge, skills, and building their experiences, the entire gamut of peace and security, okay? Such that on their own, they're able to engage in early warning, they're able to engage in conflict prevention, and where the conflicts have occurred, they are also able to engage effectively in mediation or whatever peace processes come afterwards. There's a lot of discourse about young people being actively involved, but there's also a challenge I make to young people. For you to be actively involved in anything at all, those three things must be there. You must build the knowledge, you must gain the requisite skills, and there must be the experience. And I guess with experience, it's difficult because then you have that question, how do you get the experience? And the African Union, as well as other regional organizations, are rolling out schemes increasingly to ensure that, you know, these issues are addressed in that sense. So again, Saji, let me stop here so I can have my other colleagues respond.
Dr. Aleu?
I think you have shared how we actually, in terms of framework for the question of the employment, has been one of the daunting issues. As intergovernmental agencies, we normally don't provide frameworks for employment apart from employment within our institutions, but we also help member states harmonize their own policies to address this issue. We've seen from Saji's presentation earlier that most of the green spots are in Africa, and the IGAD region was not an exception. I think the medium age in Sudan is about 20, 25, in South Sudan is about 30, and the like in Kenya and Uganda and Somalia. So we have a huge challenge when it comes to employment, and I think we have a social division that is working on creating a harmonized approach for member states to actually facilitate this space. We have been engaging and talking to ILO, which is the International Labour Organization, it's one of the UN agencies, and there are some mechanisms being put in place to just expedite within the IGAD region this space for creating jobs. Part of it is free movement policies, building connectivity roads in order for labor also to move from one place to another in the region freely without all these barriers that exist due to issues of borders, etc. Coming to the question about youth engagement, I think there was a second question. And I believe Dr. Rooks talked about the engagement in terms of giving youth the ownership to actually stand for themselves and drive the agenda. However, I believe a classical example is now unfolding behind us or before us. This is the case of Sudan, where you have protests that brought down a brutal regime of Hassan al-Bashir, General Omar Hassan al-Bashir, and it was youth-led, not parties-led, not army-led, it was youth-led. Now the youth are back to the streets again just to address the situation that happened after the military took over power single-handedly, and the youth are protesting. Now the military and the previous government representative reached an agreement, and they seem to have buried their differences, yet the youth are still in the streets. If that says anything, it says that you need to engage the youth directly. They need to hear from the other side that they are recognized, and they need to be talked to, and they need to also share their own concerns, so they are able now to arrive at a peace agreement that will serve their interests. So whether those interests of theirs are more ownership, what they would like to see in their country as civil-led country, for example, or whatever solutions the youth themselves need to come up with. I think this brings into trajectory the issue of engaging youth on prevention and on decision making, rather than just dealing with the youth always in peace building and post-conflict. Thank you.
Thank you. Powerful words. I'm going to bring in Sharon Dione from Cameroon. As a young woman in Cameroon, a young country also, you've been at the forefront of taking these global policies, continental frameworks, and saying, what does this mean to us in Cameroon? And how us as young women and men lead a process and bring the government on board. Share with us what lessons you have learned and how you are leading this process in the country, Sharon. You do some amazing work with young people affected by terrorist activities also. So share with us what you're doing and what you're learning from it.
Well, thank you very much, first of all, for the opportunity to be here. I think that this is one of the reasons why young people want to be heard, because they want platforms like this where they can be able to express themselves and show what they have. So thank you, EAA and the WISE Foundation, for this opportunity. And before I get to the lessons learned, I'm going to talk about the reason why we even decided to engage in the localization of the YPS in Cameroon. Cameroon young people have been very much involved in peace-building processes, in preventing and countering violent extremism, and even in transforming conflict and transforming violent extremism and de-radicalization processes. We as young people, we as youth actors, we involve ourselves in prisons, for instance, where we support violent actors or people who have been engaged in radicalization, in transforming them by vocational training activities within those prisons, where they can be able to learn that there are alternatives to violent extremism. We also do community dialogues, improbable dialogues, and so many other things which are related to building peace and countering violent extremism. But we realize that there are so many young people who are actually involved in these processes. We have a young person in the northwest region of Cameroon where there is conflict, in the far north doing the same thing. But because we are kind of disunited, because we have so many great ideas, we have the energy, and the energy is not canalized into something big that we can actually be able to, put ourselves together to be heard, it's always difficult for us to actually respond and have like the impact that we really want to see. So we decided to engage ourselves with the African Union, UNFPA, and other international organizations to localize the African Union Continental Framework on Youth, Peace and Security, and to ensure that the voices of young people, irrespective of where they are in different communities from across the 10 regions of our country, are actually heard, and to ensure that their opinions and what they want to see within the National Action Plan is taken into consideration. So in October, we organized the first ever national symposium on localizing the African Union Continental Framework on Youth, Peace and Security, where we mobilized over 100 young people from the 10 regions, and particularly young people from the far north region, which is affected by the Boko Haram crisis, and those in the northwest, southwest affected by the Ambazonia crisis, if I would call it like that. And here, this was a platform where the different young people that were engaged expressed themselves. They spoke about the importance of us young people collaborating and working together to ensure that government takes seriously what we want to see within the National Action Plan. And some of the lessons that we learned, that we developed into some sort of roadmap towards which we will be able to implement or develop the National Action Plan to inform over the next 5 years for Cameroon, was that we need to be able to build capacity, just as Dr. Roos was talking about, ensuring that young people have the necessary skills to be able to take action. Because it's one thing to have the energy, it's another thing to know how to effectively organize mediation processes, to be able to organize, to be able to monitor and even evaluate your actions at community levels. So that was one of the main things that the young people said they really wanted, capacity. And also at the level of seeing how we can be able to mobilize resources. With so many, let me just say that there are more than 500 civil society organizations in Cameroon, and among these 500, young people are very much active in it. And majority of them are very small And having access to resources usually makes it challenging because you're too small, they cannot trust you with those kind of huge funds. So we realize that coming together through this national action plan will permit us to be able to develop concrete programs that can actually be sponsored by these organizations or by these stakeholders. We also realize the importance of engaging in stakeholders mapping, because in Cameroon, for instance, we have a lot of international organizations. We have a lot of government actors who are working with young people, who are supporting young people. But unfortunately, access is still difficult. For you, I remember when we were having a program that we were doing, we had to go to local administrations about 5 different times soliciting just for access, just to present the activity to them. So you can imagine if it is that difficult at the local level, what more at the national level and even at the international level, where you hardly see those big guys. So we realized that engaging in a stakeholders mapping and seeing those actors who can be able to facilitate and even advocating that there are focal points for the youth peace and security agenda within those institutions that have been identified to actually facilitate access for young people. And I mean, we realized a lot of different things that young people are interested in. And we also realized within this roadmap the necessity of having a monitoring framework for young people, a youth-led monitoring framework, which would also involve evidence-based research that actually informs what we want to do. So in the scope of everything that we discussed throughout this symposium, we have started working towards actually developing our national action plan. And in the next 2-3 months, we are going to be doing a national consultation, which is youth-led also. So the 100 young people that were identified are also going to restitute these same conferences or these workshops at local levels. And it's not just going to be young people alone, because in as much as we recognize that young people make up 60% of the country's population, for instance, the remaining 40% is equally important, because they make the decisions, they have, you know, the governance and everything. So we ensure that these restitutions include traditional authorities, religious authorities. It includes IDPs, because they too have something to say, and they're also affected by the conflict. It includes women, because women are also among the most affected people, you know, during such conflicts. And also even includes children, because children also have a role to play. And why not the military? Why not the police forces? Because they are also at the forefront of security. So during these restitutions, we are going to do these consultations and find out what are the key things that we can be able to include within the National Action Plan. And also, these restitutions will enable us to be able to know that we have different conflict dynamics in Cameroon. The conflict in the Northwest, Southwest region has a different dynamic. The one in the far North region has a total different dynamic. So we cannot say that we're just going to maybe do a national symposium and then impose it in the Northwest, impose it in the far North, impose it. We need to be able to actually take into consideration those different dynamics and then bring them all together to be able to develop something that reflects the diversity of young people and at the same time ensures that we are responding to these issues with one voice. So after the development of the National Action Plan, we don't want to end there. We don't want to say, okay, fine, we have this paper, because it's going to be a paper. But after this, what are we going to do? How do we ensure that what is written down within this action plan is actually implemented? So we are going to ensure that we have, as I said before, a monitoring framework, a youth-led monitoring framework, a reporting mechanism that we can be able to show that, okay, those young people who have the opportunity to meet those big guys can actually talk for us, can be able to advocate for us, and can be able to report even to the lowest group of young people who are acting, and they can actually justify the actions that are being done. And even at the level of the government, ensure that the state has focal points where we can be able to reach out to them and work with them, which are targeting principally the the youth peace and security agenda. I strongly believe that without us having these mechanisms that ensure that we can be able to stay accountable, it will be very difficult for us to actually achieve a sustainable action plan and also be able to see how far we have come, because when we develop the action plan 5 years down the line, we should be able to sit down and assess ourselves and say, okay, fine, this is what we achieved, these are the objectives we met, and this is what has to be done in the next other 5 years. So that's where we are first. Thank you.
Wow. Wow, 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 wow. Way to commit. Way to commit. Thank you so much, Sharon, for your leadership and in this global agenda and how you're really taking ownership and making it yours. This is so critical, so thank you. We're going to cross the continent from Africa to Jordan. I'm going to bring in Saisabel Alruwaidan from Jordan, who has been leading the Youth Peace and Security Coalition in the country. Saisabel, please join us. You've been patiently listening. What have you heard? But how are you leading this work in Jordan? Please, you're most welcome, Saisabel.
Thank you, Mr. Saji. Hello, everyone. I send you my greetings from Jordan, thanking you for hosting me in this important session around YPS to have a chance to talk more about the experience of the Jordan Youth Peace and Security National Coalition. Basically, the coalition established in Jordan in 2017. The main objective of the coalition is to unify efforts at all levels to activate the resolution at the national level and organize actions relating to the youth peace and security agenda, in addition to advocacy campaigns for youth issues. Coalition members include two main components: youth and organization. The youth are the decision makers in the coalition as youth leaders representing all spectrums of society, while the organization are active organizations in the field of peace and security building, youth empowerment, and community services. The Secretariat organized the work of the coalition internally. If we want to highlight or talk deeply about what we have accomplished, if I could say that, I would say that at the international level, we were the first country in the Middle East and North Africa to initiate the establishment of the coalition. And at the national level, at first we started working to raise awareness about the resolution on two levels: the official government side and the youth side. And if I want to talk deeply about the youth themselves, the coalition serves us an incubating environment for us. For example, as an architect interested in the field of peace buildings, and my fellow members, including lawyers, teachers, and doctors, males and females, young men and women from different governorates of the kingdom, our fellow member with disabilities, all of us unite because of our great interest in peace buildings. This diversity helped us a lot in determining the needs of young people at all levels to develop a roadmap that contains a program that suits these needs. Now we could say that Jordan has a number of empowered young people around Resolution 2020-50 who are able to contribute to the peace building processes through community and electronic initiatives that will promote, maybe we could say, a culture of peace building here in Jordan. And we should not forget that the peer-to-peer education has a great influence in spreading the YPS resolution, as I personally worked on training youth leaders in Tunisia about the resolution because they wanted to transfer the experience of the national coalition to their country, and this made me so happy as I am now. Me and all members in the coalition are still participating in conferences like this to hear the experience of countries, to learn from their experience and to exchange our experiences, because we are still learning, still developing to be, inshallah, advanced in these aspects in the future. In the end, we must point out that the coalition is not a magic solution to activate the YPS resolution, but rather a start to work. Another thing I would mention that the teamwork is the basis for the success of any coalition, and the involvement of youth in the leadership specific of the coalition is one of the most important reasons for the coalition's success. Thanks for listening. Thank you.
Wow, thank you, Saisabel. The Kingdom of Jordan was the first country to actually sponsor and lead the process that led to Security Council Resolution 2250, and young people in the country then took that charge and have created a coalition to lead that process. So thank you for articulating that vision with us. As we start to wind down, we've heard from global work to regional work, continental work, and country level work. And we have His Excellency the Minister for Youth in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, who is with us on video. I'd like to invite him. He has a video presentation. I'd like for him to share his thoughts as well on video. It's in French.
Mesdames et messieurs, distingués invités, à l'occasion du 6e anniversaire de la résolution 2250 du Conseil de sécurité des Nations Unies sur jeunes, paix et sécurité, la République démocratique du Congo pense collaborer avec le jeune sur l'agenda jeunes, paix et sécurité. Et c'est là pour une double raison. Une politique et l'autre juridique. Sur le plan juridique, la question de jeunes, paix et sécurité est un engagement pour les États partis et le gouvernement, non seulement dans la résolution 2250 du Conseil de sécurité des Nations Unies, mais aussi à travers divers autres instruments juridiques nationaux et internationaux. En République démocratique du Congo, c'est d'ailleurs un engagement du gouvernement dans la constitution de la République. Sur le plan politique, cette même question rentre dans l'agenda 2030 sur le développement durable et l'agenda 2063 de l'Afrique que nous voulons. En République démocratique du Congo, impliquer les jeunes dans le processus de pacification du pays est une priorité dans le programme politique du président de la République, décliné dans le plan d'action du gouvernement. Et comment le gouvernement pense-t-il collaborer avec les jeunes pour développer des engagements nationaux pour et avec la jeunesse? C'est avec le jeune en la matière qui passe d'abord par la mise en place des structures nationales en charge de l'implémentation de la résolution 2250 et ensuite par le soutien au réseautage des structures de jeunes dans l'agenda de la paix et de la sécurité. En République démocratique du Congo, on peut donc noter comme avancée de collaboration, primo, la création par le gouvernement d'un secrétariat technique national chargé d'implémenter la résolution 2250 du Conseil de sécurité des Nations Unies, qui est doté à ce jour d'un espace de travail l'appui du gouvernement au processus du plan d'action. Segundo, l'appui du gouvernement au processus de l'élaboration du plan d'action national de mise en œuvre de la résolution 2250, dont le lancement officiel a lieu en ce 6e anniversaire de la dite résolution. Tertio, l'accompagnement du processus de mise en place de la coalition Jeunes, Paix et Sécurité pour la République démocratique du Congo en s'inspirant des modèles des autres pays d'Afrique et du monde. Je vous remercie.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for your video testimony. You've heard so far, again, from a global framework to regional bodies, to governments and young people leading the way collaboratively, not individually, but collectively, an agenda that is calling, that is needing inclusion, that is needing inclusive approaches. So I really wanted to highlight that this is a very new agenda. It's only 6 years old, which we've almost given birth 6 years ago to this agenda, and we have a long ways to go. So we really want to thank you all for joining us and being part of this conversation. Join us in making this agenda come to life with champions like this you heard today online and in person. I want to thank the Education Above All Foundation and WISE for really hosting us with Reach Out to Asia, because if not for your leadership, this won't happen. And the state of Qatar for hosting this historic once-in-a-lifetime conference starting next year in January, because you're making young people's work heard, seen, and giving the frameworks, enabling these frameworks to be acted on. So I'm really grateful for all that. And thank the audience who are joining us from around the world. Thank you to the audience who is with us here today, and all the panelists who have taken time out of your busy schedules to share your wisdom with us and your time with us. Thank you so much. Wish you a safe holiday season, and I look forward to seeing you at the Qatar conference next year as well. Thank you, and have a nice day.
Thank you.
Thank you.